This is DW News, live from Berlin. A new lifeline for the people of Gaza is taking shape. The first ship with 200 tons of food has arrived off the Gazan coast. Many more ships are expected to follow. Also coming up tonight, the leaders of Germany, France, and Poland say that they are united in preventing Russia from winning its war against Ukraine. They met today here in Berlin for talks, promising more weapons and ceaseless backing for the country. And Russians casting ballots in the country's presidential election. The outcome there is not in doubt, with those who would oppose Vladimir Putin either barred from running, locked up in prison, or dead. There have been some isolated attacks on polling stations reported today. I'm Brent Goff. To our viewers watching on PBS in the United States and to all of you around the world, welcome. A ship carrying humanitarian aid for Palestinians threatened with famine has arrived off the coast of Gaza. It's being offloaded on a purpose-built pier or jetty. And the vessel, which is operated by a Spanish charity group, left Cyprus on Tuesday. It was towing a barge laden with 200 tons of food. The ship is the first to use a new maritime corridor to reach the territory. Well, earlier, Shayna Lowe with the Norwegian Refugee Council in Jerusalem told us what she is hearing from her staff on the ground in Gaza.
The situation continues to be desperate and growing more and more desperate day by day as not enough aid is getting in and not enough aid is and the aid that is getting in isn't reaching all the people who are in desperate need. The situation is particularly dire in northern Gaza, which has been effectively cut off from southern Gaza since October. Now 5 months in to this war, we're already hearing reports of people dying of malnutrition, starvation. We only anticipate that as aid continues to be delayed getting in and not enough aid is reaching people in need, that the numbers of people dying from starvation, dehydration, and preventable diseases that they are unable to fight off because their bodies are too weak will continue to grow. And those figures could even surpass the 31,000 Palestinians killed as a result of direct hostilities.
And this first ship that's bringing in food, can you tell us tonight who will get that food? Who's going to get the first meals?
Well, there's not a lot of clarity in terms of how the distribution will actually work. It still, I think, is unclear whether this jetty that was created to offload the aid will work, and it's unclear to us who the World Central Kitchen is coordinating with in terms of distributions, and also how trucks and other essential materials needed to have distributions will be able to access that part of Gaza and conduct the distributions.
And what do you say? We've got an attempt to deliver aid now by water. We've had airdrops, Jordan, the United States, for example. Are these an acceptable alternative to deliveries by land?
There's no alternative to delivery by land. Of course, any aid entering Gaza by whatever means is essential at this point, as we have people quite literally starving to death. But we know that the most efficient, cost-effective, and fail-proof way of distributing aid is to bring that aid in through the crossings by land into Gaza, and then having those distributed by trucks. There are hundreds and hundreds of trucks waiting outside of Gaza on the Egyptian side of the border, just waiting to enter. And this is life-saving aid that is being essentially blocked from entry. We know that it's there and that it's efficient. And while we see these creative alternatives being proposed and executed, it's frustrating to see that the easiest way to get aid in is not being pursued by Israel's top allies, and instead they're resorting to measures, drastic measures like airdrops, where we've seen people even be killed by airdrops that failed and other complications.
You speak of life-saving aid. I'm wondering how life-threatening is it for people, Palestinians in Gaza, to go towards these loads of food? I mean, these people are hungry, they're desperate, and yet we've seen this past week, there have been reports that people have been shot and killed by Israeli forces trying to do just that.
This has been a trend that we've seen over the last few weeks where desperate people seeking life-saving assistance are being shot and killed. It's not always clear who, in fact, the perpetrators are, though in many of these incidents, it has been affirmed that it was Israel. But it just shows how desperate the situation is, that people are risking their lives and losing their lives trying to get that life-saving assistance, food that is desperately needed, and that needs to reach some of Gaza's most vulnerable people, children, the elderly, women, people with disabilities who are desperate for assistance.
Shane Lowe with the Norwegian Refugee Council joining us tonight from Jerusalem. We appreciate your time and all that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.
U.S. President Biden has praised a speech delivered by the Senate's top Democrat, Chuck Schumer, which called for new elections to be held in Israel. During a meeting today with Ireland's Prime Minister, Biden said that Schumer had expressed concerns shared by many Americans. Now, Schumer is also the highest-ranking Jewish official in the United States, and he called Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, an obstacle to peace in the Middle East. And he said that he has lost his way. He warned that Israel could not survive if it becomes a pariah. Netanyahu's Likud party has responded by calling on Schumer not to undermine Israel's elected government. All right, we want to get more on this now from Washington. Our correspondent Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber joins me. Benjamin, this is a story that's got some long legs on it. Tell us more about what the president had to say today.
That's right, and we can expect that the comments from Joe Biden will further frustrate not only Benjamin Netanyahu, but also his government. And the different parties have sharply criticized the comments from Chuck Schumer. And it's also a turn, because after we heard those comments yesterday, we had on one side the State Department making clear that these are Chuck Schumer's comments and he's not speaking for the Biden administration. And the White House saying that they were informed beforehand, before these comments, and that's also something that Joe Biden said today, but they were not asked for approval or for disapproval. It is not the first time that Joe Biden criticizes Benjamin Netanyahu. Recently, he also said that he accused Netanyahu of hurting Israel more than helping Israel. So definitely some more words here, even though they were a little bit vague. He said that he would not go into detail, but said that the speech that Chuck Schumer gave was good.
And I'll ask you a question we discussed last night, still pertinent tonight. Where does this leave the U.S.-Israeli relationship?
That also depends on what we will see over the next couple of days. You were just speaking about this new aid coming into Gaza. That's something that many have called humiliating, that the U.S. cannot even get its close ally Israel to open the gates to get these trucks with aid, and therefore needs to have these two other options that many experts see as less effective. So airdrops, something that the U.S. has been doing with Jordan and with other countries, and now also with ships. But definitely what we see here in Washington and also in other parts of the U.S., that the criticism is growing that for Joe Biden. Many have been calling him to get a clearer stance, get real red lines with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And they want to see him actually taking actions, not just words, but taking actions. And that goes further to not just sanctions. That's also something that we heard yesterday when the U.S. decided to sanction settlers and illegal outposts, but to tell the government of Israel if they want to continue getting U.S. weapons, that they should not go ahead with this ground offensive in Rafah that Prime Minister Netanyahu has pledged several times.
Our Washington correspondent, Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, with the latest tonight from the U.S. Capitol. Benjamin, thank you. Here's a look now at some of the other stories that are making headlines around the world this hour. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a ceasefire proposal that was put forward by Hamas. He's called it unrealistic. Hamas proposed releasing the women, children, and elderly hostages that were taken during its October 7th terror attacks in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners. Police in Somalia say that 3 soldiers have been killed and dozens of civilians wounded after al-Shabaab militants stormed a hotel near the presidential palace in Mogadishu. It took security forces 13 hours to end the siege, which began late on Thursday. They shot dead all 5 of the attackers. The hotel is popular with government officials and diplomats. Officials in the Ukrainian port city of Odessa say that 2 Russian missile strikes have killed at least 16 people and wounded dozens more. The second attack targeted paramedics who were responding to the scene of the first strike. The regional governor has declared a day of mourning on Saturday. Well, here in Berlin, the leaders of Germany, France, and Poland have concluded talks on Ukraine with a promise of more weapons and ceaseless support for Kyiv. The trio agreed their countries would provide long-distance artillery to help Ukraine defend itself against Russia. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and the French President Emmanuel Macron, they were also looking to smooth over their own differences on how best to support Ukraine.
A signal of unity and solidarity. The leaders of Germany, France and Poland showing their continuing support for Ukraine. Scholz, Macron and Tusk want to boost the supply of ammunition to Kyiv. Olaf Scholz listed ways that can be achieved quickly. Among other things, we will now procure even more weapons for Ukraine on the entire global market. This is a good improvement. Secondly, the production of military equipment will be expanded, including through cooperation with partners in Ukraine. And third, within the Ramstein format, we are establishing a new capability coalition for long-range rocket artillery. Statements of intent, but little detail. We will continue to support Ukraine and its people for as long as necessary, and we will continue, as we have done since day one, never to take the initiative of any escalation. That last point, perhaps a reference to Scholz's reluctance to provide powerful Taurus missiles from Germany's stocks. The Chancellor says sending Taurus could be seen by Russia as an escalation of the conflict. Macron has also called for nations to consider sending Western troops to Ukraine, but Scholz has ruled that out as well. So there is reason to believe these 3 countries may not be as united as they claim. Then there were these comments in the Bundestag this week from a senior member of Scholz's party. Isn't it time we not only talked about how to fight a war, but also about how to freeze a war and later to end it? Whether Tusk and Macron asked the Chancellor about that suggestion, we do not know. Instead, the public talk was only of unity. Europe and we, as the Weimar Triangle, are aware of our responsibility for the future of transatlantic relations. And we are also aware that we Europeans bear responsibility for our own security and future. And no one can take this responsibility away from us. Discussion of the best way to help Ukraine will continue, and soon. The 3 leaders will meet again next week at the European Council in Brussels.
Well, DW's chief political editor, Mela Kufner, she has more on today's 3-way talks here in Berlin.
Well, the main takeaway is the unity that these 3 key nations within the European Union have clearly made the top line of this gathering of the so-called Weimar Triangle of France, Poland and Germany for the first time at this highest level in years. Clearly, there's also more than symbolic value to France and Germany announcing that there would now be ammunition and potentially other military equipment production on Ukrainian soil together with French and German companies. We know that one company at least is already drawing up plans to become active. Now, this would potentially be a game changer, but it would also, of course, present a new target for Russia when it comes about. We also heard a pledge for a new alliance, they called it, for long-ranging missiles. We expect more concrete details on that as the US-hosted meeting of sponsors of Ukraine is happening at the Ramstein airbase here in Germany next week, but also with the upcoming EU summit, which includes a meeting of defense ministers. So the details clearly still being worked out. What all sides have in common, that they don't want Russia to win and will increase their support for Ukraine at the forefront. And, well, those issues where they don't agree simply not mentioned at this gathering today.
That was DW's Mela Kufner there reporting. I'm joined now by Christophe Gottschalk. He's a senior policy and strategy advisor and a former advisor to the French Prime Minister. Mr. Gottschalk, it's good to have you with us on this Friday evening. What did you make of today's meeting of these three leaders here in Berlin?
Thanks for having me. I think it was, in principle, really important to have that meeting. Was it necessary? Yes. Was it a turning point, a game changer? No. It was not the sort of meeting and message where we would say, you know, the whole European Union is energized now and we have a new level of security and confidence. But it was important to hold that meeting. And what was also very important is that Tusk, during the press conference, also expressed his invitation to Scholz and Macron, to Poland, so that the Weimar Triangle keeps on working. And I think these symbols are important now, but I think they could be even more confident and inspiring in the future.
If you could tell me, why do you think this meeting was important? Why did the leaders of France, Germany, and Poland, why did they need to come together now?
I think it's really important to talk here for a second about the logic of European integration and what we learned from history. So the countries, Germany, France, and Poland, are very different for so many reasons. And what we learn from the history of European integration is whenever three countries, which are really different, find a way to work together, to define their common goals, and to find a mode of functioning, then for the other member states, it is often a compromise which is helpful and which can be used. And I think this is why it was not good that the Weimar Triangle was not so present over the last months and years. And I think now with Tusk, a very, very senior, experienced European leader who was president of the council, I think there is a great opportunity to move forward in a very constructive way. And final point, when you ask why was it important, of course, there was a lot of friction between France and Germany on open stage over the last days and weeks. And it's so important to meet in person, to rebuild trust and to change the tone, of course, between the two countries.
Yeah, tone and the optics are one thing, but substance is another. We've got the French president suggesting that maybe we should talk about sending Western troops to Ukraine. We've got the German chancellor not even willing to entertain that and saying that we don't even want to send cruise missiles to Ukraine. That's a very big divide, wouldn't you say?
It's a huge divide, and this is why they have to meet much more in the coming weeks. What is important to understand is also the domestic side of things. So in France, of course, President Macron, also yesterday night on TV, he's sending messages domestically to the far left with Mélenchon, to the far right with Le Pen, who are known to be rather friendly with Russia. In Germany, of course, Scholz has to handle a very tricky coalition, and he knows from opinion polls that the German public is not so happy with the idea of sending weapons. And this, of course, explains why they are sending strong messages, but they have to come together now. I mean, if Europe has ever waited for a moment to come together, to be strong and to send a confident message to Russia, it is really now.
Christophe Gottschalk, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us tonight. Excellent analysis and context, a very important story. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Good evening.
Well, voters have begun casting ballots in Russia's three-day presidential election, with any real opposition figure either banned from running, living in exile, locked up in prison, or dead. Vladimir Putin is all but certain to remain in power. The vote has not been free from disruptions, with isolated attacks on polling stations.
Surveillance footage from outside a polling station in St. Petersburg. A woman is seen throwing a Molotov cocktail. And a polling station set on fire in the central town of Asbest. Despite these incidents, voter turnout remains high. The country's far eastern region of Kamchatka was among the first to go to the polls. This mammoth 3-day election is really all about Vladimir Putin's need for adding legitimacy to his long grip on power. But the election does shine some light onto the hopes of often overlooked ordinary Russians. From far-flung regions like Kamchatka,
it is very important to participate now, especially when the country is in this situation. You definitely need to vote.
to the capital Moscow.
What do I expect? That everything will be fine, and that the man I voted for will make our country better, and they will only move forward, not back.
Some of Russia's political elite also cast their votes here, such as Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu. Putin himself also voted online, although from an undisclosed location. Polling stations are even open in places under Russian occupation, such as Donetsk.
Thanks to Putin for paying us pensions for tranquility that we now have in Donetsk, so everything is well.
At a polling station in Siberia, a Yakut shaman performed a ritual calling on the spirits to help people make their choice. And while that choice appears to have already been made, these elections act as a reminder that there is far more to Russia than just Vladimir Putin.
Well, DW's Yuri Reshedo is in Riga, where he has been based since Russian authorities shut down DW's Moscow bureau 2 years ago. He told us why voter turnout is now so important to Vladimir Putin.
Turnout is very important for Putin, not the election itself. You're right, because Putin, of course, knows very well that he will win this election. And in order to achieve this high turnout, the election will be held over 3 days for the first time, by the way. In addition, the authorities are relying on electronic voting. The figure of 80% is what Putin's political advisors, his circle, and the presidential administration have come up with. Putin is supposed to get 80% of the votes in order to increase his power to the maximum. On the one hand, his circle, they can say, hey, we've done our job well, and if this figure is reached. And on the other hand, Putin can then more easily realize his policies. And this is not just about the election gifts he promised to the nation in his recent speech, such as the pension increase and so on. Rather, it's about unpopular measures, such as the tax increase. Some suspect that the highest taxes are to support Putin's expansive war policy, but there are also fears of a new wave of mobilization. Extremely unpopular in Russia, high voter turnout could legitimize this.
Well, ahead of the election, Yuri Reshedo interviewed Boris Nemtsov. He's an opposition politician who garnered enough support to defy Putin in the presidential election, but was barred from being put on the ballot.
Mr. Nadezhdin, you were the only potential presidential candidate who openly opposed the war in Ukraine. Why was this so important to you?
I have long believed that Putin is leading Russia in the completely wrong direction, on a path of authoritarianism, militarization and isolation. This is completely the wrong direction. Over many centuries, Russian monarchs and political leaders have fallen into this rut. It always ended very badly.
Thousands of Russians supported you. What does this say about the people who took to the streets despite the frost and stood in line to give their signature for you?
It showed that in reality there is no such thing as general support for either Putin or a special military operation in Russia. If you ask, do you want to continue to fight until victory to take Kyiv, or do you want to stop all this immediately and move on to a peaceful negotiation? You know the majority of Russians choose the second answer, an end to the conflict and a transition to peace talks.
You say that there is no vibrant support of Putin's policies, that people want peace. However, none of the other candidates do, and we are talking about the other 3 candidates besides Putin. There are 4 in total. Why did none of them criticize the war in Ukraine?
These candidates were nominated by the official opposition. The official opposition in the Russian parliament fully support Putin 100%. This is, by the way, one of the country's problems? This is one of the important questions. Putin made a fatal mistake by launching a military operation. Before that, for a quarter of a century, he has been destroying the key institutions of the Russian state, including the parliament. We do not have an independent parliament. The majority of people in the country are in favour of peace negotiations, but there is not a single deputy in parliament, not a single one, who would vote for this.
But doesn't it even make sense to hold elections in Russia, or is democracy over?
Of course it does. Putin believes that it is very important that there are elections, so he can see that the people support him. The Kremlin administration is trying very hard to frame the election campaign so that Putin thinks 80% of Russians are with him.
And how do you feel about it?
In a fair election, Putin would, of course, not get 80%. If I participated, I believe I would get 30%.
Many fear that after Putin's likely re-election, there will be a tightening of the screws. Some people are afraid of mobilization. What do you think will change in political life? What's your opinion?
Nothing will change. Putin is a politician who knows very well how to maintain power. He will not give the security forces too much power. For what? It's dangerous for him.
And why?
Putin knows the history of Russia very well. Surely he also knows the history of numerous palace coups of the 18th century, when the National Guard decided who the emperor would be. Putin doesn't want this. Therefore, he will not hand power to the security forces.
Boris Nadezhdin, thank you very much for speaking to DW.
It was Yuri Rasheta reporting there. Here's a reminder now of our top stories. A ship carrying humanitarian aid for Palestinians who are threatened with famine has arrived off the coast of Gaza with 200 tons of food. The boat set off from Cyprus 3 days ago. It is the first to use a new maritime aid corridor to reach the territory. And the leaders of Germany, France, and Poland have concluded talks on Ukraine here in Berlin. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz vowing to increase weapons productions for Kyiv. This is DW News. After a short break, I'll be back to take you through the day. Stick around. We'll be right back.